I'm really glad to have so many people. I can see that there are a lot of people who have joined us tonight for this conversation because it's such an important one. And I'd like to start out simply by saying this. Hate crimes are a serious problem in our country, in our state, and in this community. And we at the District Attorney's Office in Adams and Broomfield counties are deeply, deeply committed to addressing them and prosecuting them to the fullest extent. And we're going to talk a little bit tonight about what constitutes a hate crime, what the statutes say about hate crimes, what law enforcement can do about hate crimes, and what you can do about hate crimes. Before we get into that, though, I want to recognize and turn over the floor for a few minutes to Harry Buddhasiddhartha. Harry is a longtime friend of mine. We went to law school together. He was a public defender before becoming the chair of the organization that he now represents, serving the Asian American community. And Harry, I'd like to turn it over to you to make some opening remarks and talk about, from your perspective, the importance of this issue.
Great. Thank you so much, Brian. And it is my pleasure to be here with all of you. As Brian mentioned, my name is Harry Buddhasiddhartha. I am the Executive Director of Asian Pacific Development Center, which is a local nonprofit that has been serving the immigrant and refugee communities in Colorado over the past 40 years. I want to thank all of you for attending this town hall. I am happy to see an outpouring of community support, but I am also saddened that we even have to hold this town hall in the first place. Unfortunately, hate crimes is not a new issue for our Asian community. After all, the first race riot that happened in Denver happened back in 1880, and that was when a mob of white men went on a rampage and destroyed Chinatown and hanged one Chinese man. Nobody was ever prosecuted for the murder of this innocent man or for the destruction of Denver's only Chinatown. In 1982, Vincent Chin was murdered by a group of white men because they thought that he was Japanese and responsible for the loss of their job. The white men were prosecuted, but only ended up serving 3 years probation and paying $3,000 fine for the murder of a man. And recently, just last year in April 2020, a Sikh owner of a liquor store was ran over by a racist bigot after the racist screamed, "Go back to your country." Fortunately, the store owner received appropriate medical treatment, and that case is currently being prosecuted as a hate crime. As Brian mentioned, the mass shooting that happened in Atlanta, that happened less than a month ago. Ever since then, we have received an outpouring of support from various community leaders, our allies, and elected officials. I want to thank the 17th Judicial District Attorney, the Broomfield Police Department, and the U.S. Attorney's Office for being here. I sincerely appreciate their support of our community and their willingness to take a strong stand and to condemn acts of hate crimes. Today, you will learn a lot of useful information from our law enforcement partners and also from APDC's very own Victim Assistance Department about resources that are available to you. The biggest takeaway that I want all of you to have from this town hall is that, number one, our community is strong and resilient. Number two, there are a lot of good people and great allies that are working tirelessly to fight back against hate crimes. I am glad to see so many elected officials and community leaders taking a strong stand against these acts of hate crimes. And lastly, the biggest takeaway that I want all of you to have is that you should never be afraid to report hate crimes, regardless of your ethnicity, your immigration status, or whether or not you are fluent in English. That's why we are doing this town hall, is to share the resources that we have with all of you, and also to encourage all of you to stand with us to condemn these acts of hate crimes. Together, all of us will get through this. So I want to thank Brian again, and right back to you, Brian.
Thank you so much, Harry, and thank you for being here, and thank you for your incredible leadership on this issue, and for being a part of the Adams County and Broomfield communities in such a powerful way. I want very much for this event tonight to be a conversation, as much as we're able to make it a conversation and as much as we're technically able to make it a conversation. So I'd like to just give you all a little bit of a primer on what we're going to do tonight. I've got a few people that we've invited to speak on a few topics related to hate crimes and to what we can do about them. And then we'll open it up for questions. And hopefully you can put your questions in the chat, and then I will direct those questions as best I can to the panelists and to the folks that we have tonight. What I'd like to do now is ask one of my deputy district attorneys from the DA's office, Kim Hinton, to talk a little bit about what constitutes a hate crime. I can tell all of you before I turn it over to Kim that I personally have prosecuted hate crimes in my career as a district attorney. And I find those prosecutions to be righteous and super important. But I can also tell you candidly that they're hard. They're hard cases. They're hard cases to prove because the statute makes them hard to prove. And we can have a dialogue about that tonight. I don't say that to make excuses. I don't want anyone to perceive it that way. We are going to take every hate crime that happens in the 17th Judicial District seriously and prosecute it fervently. But it is important for you to know what the law says. And so, Kim, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about that.
Thank you, Brian. And I'm going to try to share my screen here. So if folks aren't able to see it, if you could just pop something in the chat and let me know. So the first one I wanted to talk about is the actual bias-motivated crime statute itself. Oops, that's moving around on me. And so essentially what we have to prove in every crime is that it is in the state of Colorado at or about the date and place charged and done by a certain person. But beyond that, what we have to prove for this specifically is that it is done with the intent to either intimidate or harass another because of that person's either actual or perceived race, color, religion, ancestry, national origin, physical or mental disability, or sexual orientation. And it also requires that there be another crime. So what those are outlined in the statute is either knowingly causing a bodily injury, and I had actually cut off there, knowingly causing a bodily injury. So that's a class 5 felony if it is conducted by one person acting alone. It's a higher level of felony, what's called a class 4 felony, if there are more than one person acting together. And so that is an increased penalty if there's more than one person who causes bodily injury, and they do so with the intent to intimidate or harass another because of that person's protected class. The second bias-motivated crime that's specifically outlined by the statute is if, by words or conduct, somebody knowingly places another person in fear of imminent lawless action directed at that person or property, their property, and such words or conduct are likely to produce bodily injury to that person or damage to that person's property. And that still requires that that person have the intent to intimidate or harass another because of that person's actual or perceived protected class. That's a class 1 misdemeanor in Colorado. The third bias-motivated crime that's outlined by the statute is if that person is acting with that same intent, they knowingly cause damage to or destroy the property of another person. And again, that's a class 1 misdemeanor. So those are one of the statutes that we have in Colorado. And there's a number of things that make proving that crime difficult. First of all, we've got the most specific mental state that exists in criminal statutes. So we have to prove that they actually intended to do so, and that they intended to do so because of one of those protected classes when they commit those other crimes. The second crime that we have that's a bias-motivated crime in Colorado is not a separate crime itself, but an enhancement to our harassment statute. And that's Kiana Ariano's law. And that makes it a class 1 misdemeanor if somebody commits the crime of harassment and they do so with the intent to intimidate or harass another person because of that person's protected class. Again, this is that highest mental state that we have in Colorado law, so the most specific that we have to prove. And it also requires that we prove that that intent was done to intimidate or harass that person because of one of those protected classes. And so with those, sometimes, as Brian mentioned before, it gets very difficult for us to prove those cases. So in one case, for example, that we have had, we were able to pursue the case, and that case is pending, so I cannot share a lot of information. However, in that case, the person, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing these statutes, the person, the defendant, broke into a church and damaged a number of pieces of that church's property. And on the sidewalk near the church, they wrote, "F your religion." So we were able to prove specifically that they committed that crime as a offense where they are targeting that church because of that protected class of religion. Compare that to something that we could not pursue as a hate crime because it doesn't meet any of those elements for either the bias motivated or the harassment because of who it was directed at. So in that case, after somebody was arrested, they began, during the booking process, to use racial slurs towards specific police officers based on what that person perceived those police officers' race or color to be. And so he directed the N-word towards Black officers, he directed a racial slur towards Hispanic officers, and he specifically did that towards the officers he perceived to be one race or another. Because the officers were not likely to respond in a disorderly fashion, they're police officers, we were not able to pursue a hate crime charge for that portion of the offense. And so while we know it's a hateful thing, while we know it's definitely a hate incident, that was not something that could rise to the level of a hate crime. And sometimes we end up in those situations. That being said, we still want to encourage people to report, because if it doesn't get investigated by the officers, then we cannot later follow up if it does turn out to be a hate crime. And so we want to really encourage people to come forward. And I know Harry and probably Newman will talk about some of the things that can happen and ways that you can discuss reporting those to community organizations. But again, if law enforcement doesn't know, they aren't able to follow up, investigate, and our office isn't able to pursue the charges as a hate crime. Back to you, Brian.
Kim, thank you so much, and I really appreciate that presentation. And I also want to just thank Kim for her work in helping us plan and arrange this gathering tonight. The next person I'd like to call on is Chief Gary Krieger from the Broomfield Police Department. Chief Krieger is a longtime member of the Broomfield Police Department and is a real leader in this community who has a lot to share on this topic. And I'm grateful for him being a part of our meeting tonight. Chief Krieger.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me tonight. And I just want to say that, you know, all the police chiefs, along with Brian, are committed to ensuring the safety of our communities, and that includes everybody in our communities. And as we respond to reports of crime, we're not only going to be looking and asking questions about the elements of the crime, as you just heard about, whether it be harassment or property destruction, but really the why. Because what's motivated that crime comes down to the why, and that goes to the intent, which is a key piece of proving the crime. And then we work with Brian and his staff to make sure that the charges are appropriate for the hate crime. But the key is, again, to what Harry had to say, is you should never be afraid to report to law enforcement you're a victim of a crime. We're not going to ask you about your immigration status. We have no authority to enforce immigration status. We want to hear from you and do everything we can to help protect you. And we train our officers not only to look for the elements of the crime there that you're reporting, but the why. So we're going to ask questions of, what did he say, or she say? What words did they use? What objects did they draw? What damage did they cause that are specific? Sometimes that's very easy to determine. Other times can be very difficult. In a recent case that involved in the metro area, they weren't really saying anything, but when we went back and looked at it, and this case is filed in Denver, but it involved a lot of jurisdictions through the Front Range. They're only targeting one group of people. All their victims were one group of people. And so those are a little bit more subtle to investigate. But as we look at these, we're going to be really looking at the motivation or the why, and it specifically goes to that intent, so that we can accurately assess and make sure we're charging appropriately, working with Brian and his staff. Brian, back to you.
Much, Chief Krieger, and if folks have questions for the chief, hopefully he can stay on for a couple more minutes. Another important thing for everyone to know is that even though we at the District Attorney's Office are charged with protecting this community and prosecuting crimes that happen in our community, we also have federal partners who have other tools at their disposal, sometimes ones that we don't have in our local jurisdictions. And that's why I'm so happy to have tonight our U.S. Attorney for the state of Colorado, Matt Hirsch, who's joining us to talk a little bit about the federal response to hate crimes and what his office does and what the federal government can do in terms of civil rights violations and other things when it regards hate crimes. Matt, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks for having me. As Brian said, I'm Matt Kirsch. I'm the acting U.S. Attorney for the District of Colorado. And I want to start by talking about federal hate crimes. And then I want to go what could be construed as slightly off topic and talk about some civil rights remedies that we have, but I think they still make a lot of sense for the conversation that we're having this evening. And I'll come back to this, but the folks in the community who are listening to this should take comfort from the fact that you're hearing from all of these different agencies. You ought to understand that that's a demonstration of how the different law enforcement agencies in Colorado work together in order to try to most effectively address hate crimes and all other kinds of crimes. So when we're talking about federal hate crimes, we're talking about crimes that are very similar to those that you heard in the description from the DA's office. Unfortunately, federal hate crimes are even more limited than those that are prescribed by state law in two ways. First of all, a federal hate crime almost always requires either actual violence or at least a threat of violence. Second, the violence or the threat of violence to be a federal crime must occur in connection with a more limited set of activities. They can be activities where the violence or the threats were motivated solely by a person's race, religion, or color or national origin, many of the same categories that you heard described in the state crime. It can be violence that occurs in connection with the exercise of constitutional rights like voting or speech or religion, or it can be violence that occurs in connection with housing. So there, as I said, this is a more limited set of activity than is covered by the state law. But nevertheless, when these crimes occur, we are very interested in prosecuting them. We have a criminal civil rights coordinator in our office, an assistant U.S. attorney named Brian Fields. And he or anybody in our office wants to hear about any of this kind of conduct. The second thing that I want to make sure everybody knows is that there is an area in which federal law provides much more broad remedies than with respect to hate crimes. And that is the enforcement of federal civil rights in a civil context. That occurs when these kind of violations occur, when discrimination based on any of the factors that everybody's been talking about tonight, race, religion, color, national origin, gender, sexual orientation in some cases, if discrimination motivated on the basis of any of those factors occurs in housing or education or employment or activities or entities that receive federal funding, or even perhaps the broadest in the fifth category, what's called public accommodation. What public accommodation means are businesses that are open to the public. So that includes restaurants, stores, transportation providers. That's very broad. To give you an example, our office recently settled a case with the state of Colorado's administrative court system. And we had brought an action against them because that court system was failing to provide sufficient language access for non-English speakers. And so that is a much broader area of discrimination that could occur against your community or any other kinds of communities where our office may be able to help remedy that discrimination. We have a civil rights coordinator in our office for this purpose as well. He's actually on the call tonight. His name is Zayan Wu. And I'm going to ask Zayan, as I move into the next section, to put his contact information into the chat box, as well as some other information about reporting to federal authorities. I really want to second what you already heard tonight. None of the authorities here can take any action if we don't know about this conduct. So please report any of this kind of conduct when it happens. If you aren't sure whether something might satisfy one of these statutes, please report it anyway. One of the things that we find is that something that happens that might be insufficient to take action in isolation might be actionable when it gets combined with other reports. In many cases, in federal law, we have to prove that an entity or a business or a person engaged in a pattern of activity. And so your report of a single incident, even if we can't take action just based upon that, may help us establish a pattern of discriminatory activity that would allow us to take action later on. So please don't be concerned about wasting our time with any kind of a report. Combating this activity, as Brian said, is a fundamental part of our jobs. In fact, the Attorney General for the United States just announced at the end of last month a Department of Justice-wide 30-day review whose purpose is to make certain that the department is maximizing the resources that it is applying towards dealing with hate-based crimes and other hate-based incidents. And please don't worry about whether you're reporting something to the right place. The benefit, again, that you see of all of the different entities who've come together to bring this presentation tonight is that we have relationships with each other. We can get reports to the right place. So please don't focus on that. Just focus on reporting so that we can try to help address this conduct. The last thing that I want to say is also similar to what Chief Krieger said. My office doesn't do immigration enforcement. The FBI, who is the primary agency that investigates federal hate crimes, they don't do immigration enforcement either. If you report this conduct to our office, we're not going to ask you about your immigration status, even though we're part of the federal government, and neither is the FBI. And if we get that information, we don't use it. We don't turn it over to immigration authorities. Our job is to prosecute federal hate crimes and to remedy federal civil rights violations. And those are the purposes that we would use any information we get from you. So thanks very much for the opportunity to speak tonight.
Thank you so much, U.S. Attorney Matt Kirsch. I really appreciate what you shared with us tonight and your sharing with us folks from your staff who work on these important cases. And if I can just underline one thing to all those who are listening now, and for anyone who may watch this recording later on, what Matt said, and that is, if you are a victim of a hate crime, please report. Please report. We are not interested in looking into your immigration status, as Chief Krieger stated, and as Matt even alluded to. I don't have the authority to enforce anything regarding immigration violations. My job is to keep you safe. My job is to seek justice for everyone who is a victim in my jurisdiction. It doesn't matter whether you were born here, whether you came here, whether you're friends with somebody here. It doesn't matter. We want everyone who is in this community to be safe and to feel safe. And anyone who is a victim of a hate crime, we will prosecute the offender. It doesn't matter who you are or where you're from or what you look like. Again, thank you so much, U.S. Attorney Kirsch, for being here. Now I'd like to switch gears for just a little bit and talk about victim services. So Kim Hinton in her presentation talked about how difficult it is to prosecute hate crimes. I don't want anyone to take away from this that we're not serious about prosecuting them. We are very serious about it. But I also want to be honest about the fact that they're challenging cases. That said, we always have services that we can give to victims of any crime, but certainly of hate crimes when they happen in our jurisdiction. And so I'm really pleased tonight to introduce two terrific professionals in our jurisdiction to talk a little bit about victim services and ways that you can get help if you are a victim of a crime or if you know someone who is a victim of a crime. Newman Lee was a victim advocate here in the 17th Judicial District several years ago and was a terrific member of our staff. I don't see her up on the screen yet, but I'm also, we can also bring up Claire Colangelo. Claire was one of my very first hires as the newly elected district attorney here in the 17th Judicial District. I hired Claire as my director of victim services and our victim witness office. And Claire oversees our victim advocates here in the 17th Judicial District. And there's Newman to join us as well. And these are two professionals, fantastic women who have amazing experience in victim services and who are deeply, deeply committed to serving victims of crime, particularly victims of hate crimes. So Newman and Claire, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Newman, if you'd like to begin first, and then I can speak after you. We can take the turns that way.
Okay, of course. Hi, my name is Newman Lee, and I am the Victim Assistant Director at the Asian Pacific Development Center. Thank you for having me here and being part of this really important conversation. I feel like outside of just the system that's been set up within the criminal justice system itself, many of our community members and communities have this sense of fear in getting involved with the system. A lot of it comes from what they know and what they hear within the community itself, as well as the mentality of bothering someone, which I know one of the speakers had brought up. The issue is that with us being a community-based organization, we work alongside with systems-based as well as other nonprofit to provide comprehensive and case management direct service, regardless of if there is a police report to police or a case in the DA's office. With that being said, we all know that hate crime itself is definitely underreported, and that there's not the number that we're seeing that is happening nationwide. And a lot of that, again, comes back to that hesitation of that's just part of being an immigrant, or that's just part of the identity of the Asian American lifestyle. And I feel like a lot of that comes from education within the community, as well as education with our systems partner to really do outreach and awareness in what is actually happening. We work with a variety of individuals in the community as community leaders to bring awareness to the current crimes that are occurring, yet there are always pockets of community members who do not want to get involved. With that being said, that's where we come in from the APDC community service side, when we're able to take potential report and go from there. Of course, we want it to still be a trauma-informed and victim-centered approach to where it's up to the victim if they do want to proceed to actually make a law enforcement report or not. And if they don't, we're able to try to collect that information so that we're able to share to show the actual numbers that are occurring out there. And many of this, again, comes back with education. Town halls like this has been great to do outreach, but we need more awareness on both our end within the community as well as with our partners so that we can work together to show that this is a partnership, that it's not a competition. It's not one where we are, if you're coming to me on a community base, I will automatically just report to law enforcement if that's not what you want to do. Again, we want to allow this to be a voice for the AAPI community and anyone who has experienced any sort of hate crime out there, within within the state of Colorado in general.
All right, can you all hear me okay? Can you all hear me okay? Okay, I assume everyone can hear me. Oh yes, perfect, thank you. Newman, thank you so much for sharing. So I wrote down some of my thoughts just so that I could stay on track, but as Brian said, I'm Claire Colangelo. I'm the Director of Victim Witness with the 17th Judicial District Attorney's Office. So for those who are going through the process of going through a court case, we and our victim advocates would assist you through that and be your advocate through that process. So professionally, I'm speaking to you here at this town hall from the perspective of victim advocacy as the Director of Victim Witness. But as an American raised by Korean immigrants and raised actually in Atlanta, Georgia, I come to you as a fellow Asian American who has firsthand been targeted by these types of acts. So I come from you from both lenses. So first, I want to just, highlight what has been discussed before. Loud and clear. Sorry, am I too loud? I'll try to be a little quieter. So first, the aggression and violence against our communities is nothing new. Let me state that clearly. I want you all to know that while I welcome and appreciate the spotlight that illuminates these issues in the mainstream in modern day, those of us in our skin know that we've been dealt this hand: harassment, mistreatment, or violence across the span of history. Secondly, for those of us here who have the privilege of never having been targeted due to our skin color, thank you also for being here. I assume you are here as an ally to learn more and to see how you can serve your fellow AAPI community members, so I thank you as well. The recent attacks on AAPI communities are shocking, but not surprising to many of us, because the face of racism more often looks like small attacks rather than big headline-grabbing crimes. They look a certain way to us. The majority of racially motivated incidents that are in communities look like a hard shove in the back while a racial epithet is hurled at you. It could also look like being hit in the face by a passerby while being told to leave their country. It also can look like having a passing car throw an object at you, or having a group taunt you while pulling back their eyelids. And I put in parentheses, and yes, these are all incidents that have happened just to me. So I know firsthand that these incidents can happen, and they happen across to many of our fellow AAPI members. These incidents happen often, and they are over swiftly. But the culmination of these experiences are powerful at keeping our communities down in silence and submission, because we know accountability is sometimes unattainable. The perpetrator is often gone as quickly as he or she came. I say all this to say that our reactions, the hesitancy or unwillingness to report, are also not new. They are rooted in our cultural ideals to reach inward for strength and to foster that inner strength, even if it manifests as silence. For many first-generation immigrants like my parents, language barriers also keep us in silence. And silence also comes from the fact that we are grasping at a way to gain some sense of power. To act unaffected, as if we are unswayed, puts some level of power back into our hands, especially knowing the likelihood of accountability for the perpetrator can be slim. However, I want to underline the fact that ultimately, these incidents have lasting and detrimental effects and ultimately achieve precisely what the perpetrators want, which is to keep our communities down if we do not report and do not get action on these cases. So I wanted to offer some ideas for those who have been victimized by these types of incidents or crimes. If you have been impacted by a hate crime that was either not reported or cannot be prosecuted, my charge to you would be to do the following. So I would encourage you all to write down your stories. Even if you stay silent, write down your stories. Even if it's in a journal that only you will read, write it down, because someday perhaps you would like to share it with someone to report it. You don't need to read, or if you don't wish to report it, you can choose just to write it down and not read it again. But it's a way to know that what happened to you was real and that you did not make it up and it was not a figment of your imagination. There are also trauma therapists who can work with you. Trauma therapists are out in our general community, but choosing a therapist of color may also help you. Reach into communities of your same race and ethnicity. The power in sharing stories and experiences with others who have gone through what you have is very strong. If you are feeling anxious or worried about hearing stories like this in the media, especially with the recent spotlight that we have been given, or likely more so than those emotions, you may be feeling exhausted. If that is the case, my charge to you would be to continue to reach in and plug into communities of your same race and ethnicity. For me, as a Korean American, for many Korean Americans, church is often just as valuable for people to connect over color, custom, and culture as it is for faith. Limit your social media and news media consumption. So, news media is saturated, social media is saturated. Sometimes we need to take a break to continue to care for yourself and your mental health as well. Again, work with a trauma therapist. There are also grassroots organizations such as Stop AAPI Hate, as well as, again, there's the nonprofit Asian Pacific Development Center. And the DOJ also has information on hate crimes and how to report them. These ideas that I just proposed are not comprehensive, but they may offer some outlet for you. And perhaps even if not leading to a sweeping change in the immediate future, they can lead us to incremental changes that can lead to a better future for the generation of AAPI that follow us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire and Newman. I'm just really proud to have, first of all, Newman, your history with our office, having worked as a victim advocate in the 17th, and I'm proud of the professional successes you have had since leaving our office and the service you continue to do. And Claire, I'm incredibly proud that you are on our staff and leading our victim witness office. So thank you to both of you, and thank you for your words tonight. We're going to give one more shot at playing the video from our County Commissioner, Lynn Baca. And after we give that a try, we'll take any questions that any of you may have. So let's give one more try to this video.
Good evening. My name is Lynn Baca, and I serve as an Adams County Commissioner representing District 5. I am also honored to represent our community as part of the Colorado Asian Chamber of Commerce. I am a second-generation Adams County resident who grew up in Brighton, and I am the first Latina Asian Pacific Islander to be elected to the Adams County Board of Commissioners. My roots in this community run deep. Growing up, my grandfather was a farmer in unincorporated Adams County. I care deeply about this wonderful place we call home. Our residents deserve to live in safe neighborhoods, to earn a living, to reach their fullest potential, and to have a great quality of life. Opportunities abound in Adams County, and I want to help our residents act on them. Adams County is an inclusive, diverse community. I am here today to tell you that myself, my colleagues on the Adams County Board of Commissioners, and Adams County staff stand with our Asian American Pacific Islander community. We will not tolerate any acts of harassment, violence, or intimidation against this community or any other community members. One of our goals as a board is community enrichment. Our residents should feel safe and protected within their neighborhoods and should feel comfortable to actively engage in their community. We continue working to make Adams County the most innovative and inclusive county in the country. We stand arm in arm with District Attorney Mason to ensure our Asian American Pacific Islander community members feel safe and thrive in Adams County. Thank you.
I know we lost the volume for just a minute there, but I hope most of you were able to hear what Commissioner Baca said, and I appreciate her contributing that. And I know that all of our county commissioners and frankly all of our leaders from throughout the 17th Judicial District care about this issue and wanted me to convey that tonight in this call. I see one question in the Ask a Question category. You can put a question in the Ask a Question app or whatever we call that, or you can also put it in the chat. I will certainly answer this first question and then take any others that may be out there. And if we don't have more questions, then we'll wrap up. So the question that has been asked here in the Ask a Question format is, what happens once a hate crime is reported? So once a hate crime is reported, it's investigated. And it's investigated by the agency that it's reported to. So if a hate crime happens in the city of Westminster and a victim reports that to the Westminster Police Department, then the Westminster Police Department investigates. They investigate by speaking to the victim. They investigate by speaking to other potential witnesses. They investigate by asking the suspect if he or she wishes to make a statement. And then they present that evidence to the district attorney's office, so to my office. Once evidence of a hate crime is presented to my office, we evaluate that office and then evaluate it with the statutes and the law and determine whether or not we can charge a crime and determine which crime that is. And if it meets the statutory definitions that are laid out in the law, as Kim Hinton discussed earlier, then we at the district attorney's office file charges, whether that's a felony or a misdemeanor or some combination thereof. Once those charges are filed, we shepherd that case through the criminal justice system. It starts over in our county court unit, and then if it's a felony, it moves up to our district court judges, and then the case is either resolved with some kind of an agreement between the parties, or it goes to trial. And then after a conviction is achieved, if it's achieved, then a sentencing hearing occurs and a judge will impose a sentence. So that's just sort of a basic rundown of what happens when a crime is reported. It's investigated, we charge it, and then we prosecute it. Does anybody else have any questions for me or for any of our speakers tonight who were a part of this evening's panel? Matt Kirsch from the U.S. Attorney's Office, I see you back on the screen. I don't know if that's intentional or not. I hope it is. Please share whatever you'd like to share.
I was just asked to join again there, Brian. I would echo what Brian said about what happens when a hate crime is reported. The only thing that I would add to that, which is certainly true in the federal system, and I suspect is at least sometimes true in the state system, is that sometimes there will be additional investigation after the crime is reported, but before a charging decision is made. And sometimes that investigation, at least in the federal system, can take some time. Sometimes it takes months for us. And part of the reason for that is an attempt to be as comprehensive as we can in gathering all of the evidence that might help us prove a hate crime. So if people do report a hate crime, I just wouldn't want them to be discouraged at the front end if they didn't see anything that felt like immediate action. That might simply mean that the investigation was ongoing to try to get to the point that Brian described of analyzing all of the evidence and figuring out whether it matches up with the elements of those crimes and would support a charge.
Thank you so much, Matt. I really appreciate that. Are there any other questions for me or for Matt or for Claire or Newman or for Harry Buddhasiddhartha or for Chief Krieger? I can see at the bottom of my screen that we have 74 participants tonight. I'm really honored to have had so many people participate and watch this. And I hope anyone who watches this later, the recording, which we will post, will have learned something about what we do and what we can do about hate crimes. We're coming up on an hour, so I'm going to wrap up now. If there's anything that I want you to take away from our event tonight and from this conversation, it's this. We at the District Attorney's Office and all of our partners throughout the 17th Judicial District, Adams and Broomfield, and throughout Colorado care about the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. We care about crimes. Before I finish this, it looks like I'm getting another question. What is the best way for community members to support the AAPI community? I really appreciate that question. I think there's lots of ways you can. One of my colleagues and longtime friends today actually sent me a video and a little presentation on bystanders, what bystanders can do, when they see a hate crime in progress. I encourage you to look those things up. I'm sorry I don't have the link at my fingertips, but we'll put it in. We'll put it on the chat, or we'll put it on our social media platforms. I think that one way we can support the AAPI community is by attending events like this and talking openly about the fact that we support our brothers and sisters in this community, and that we all won't tolerate hate crimes in our community. This has to be something that not just elected officials say, not just district attorneys say, not just U.S. attorneys and police officers, but community members, friends. And we can say it out loud on social media, in community groups. Those things really do matter. Thank you, Harry, for putting the bystander training link up there. That was great. Thank you for doing that. Any other questions before I wrap up, right before 7 o'clock? Again, let me just finish what I was about to say, and that is this. The district attorney's office, our partners in law enforcement throughout the state, care about this community. We hear and hurt with you during the suffering that you have experienced over these past several months, and frankly, the history of anti-Asian discrimination that has occurred and gone in many ways unremarked on and not discussed for not just decades, but centuries of American history. I know that, I hear that, we know that, and we hear that, and we care about you, and we want you to know that we are here to support you. And again, we are here to prosecute and get justice anytime a hate crime occurs. When and if it does, please report it, and please know that your partners here at the DA's office and throughout our community will be here to support you. Thank you to everyone who helped make this event possible tonight. Thank you for your patience as we had some technical difficulties. It was our first time again using this platform, but I think we persevered, and I'm really grateful to everyone for participating in this important discussion. Thank you so much. Be safe and have a good night.